Once again, I'm Bianca Gishangi and Tim Kalman, Director of Carbon Africa. We will both be taking you through today's session. And just a reminder, if you're not speaking, to kindly keep yourself muted. Use the chat function for questions and mention the name of the presenter you wish to send your question to. The presentations will be shared, and we are doing an exercise on Excel. So we kindly encourage you to be using your laptops today. And in terms of camera, you may turn it on when instructed. So we will start off with a recap from yesterday, and then we'll go straight into the Excel calculation. And just as a brief overview, I think we covered quite a bit of information. We went through the carbon asset project development cycle. And if you recall, we had a whole exercise on pinning the different parts and stages of the cycle, which starts with the idea and the concept. Then you have the national approval, and then you have validation of the project. Then you have registration, and then registration doesn't. Sorry, if you can please mute yourself.
Maybe you're in a very bad.
All right. Yeah. So just a reminder that once you register, there's still more work to be done. You need to actually monitor, and then you need to report based on the project, the PDD that you submitted before. And then you do get verified to make sure that it's that the units that would be issued are real and authentic. And then, of course, after that, if you're successful with verification, then you get issued with your credit. Bit of a process. And then there were different components that make up these carbon projects, and we have the different standards. So we had the compliance standard, which was the CDM, and is under the UNFCCC. But we also had a demonstration of other voluntary standards that are used quite a bit in the country, such as Gold Standard, Vera, and Plan Vivo. And then we also saw that there are different types of projects in different sectors. We also saw there's different scales, small scale projects such as programs of activities, which can also grow to be into many into large POAs, but then we also have project activities, which are singular. And then we have components that are really key when you're developing your project, which is the baseline. And a lot of these requirements for the baseline are found in methodologies. As we mentioned, there are very, very many methodologies and highly specific to what you want your projects to be in. So it's really important that you do the correct research when you're trying to start your project and you find the right methodology. Then it also has to meet the requirements of additionality, sustainable development goals, and stakeholder consultation. This is because you want to ensure that it is getting that extra sustainable development benefit beyond just the lowering of emissions. And then lastly, we also looked at transactional costs, because that whole long cycle that we've been through, each of the different stages require different costings. There's costings in registering, in monitoring, in verifying, and the actual project itself. So you have to factor in all this when you are developing it. So you have to be really committed because it's quite a bit of work and needs to capture a lot of costs. Then we had an in-depth look at the auditing process, because this is something that often quite a lot of projects got stuck on. And we realized that moving forward, you need a lot of proper verification. And we had an expert who's Kenyan who was giving us their first-hand experience, David Lubaga. So we also learned what it takes to be an auditor in terms of the company itself, but also as an individual, what is required. And then we also looked at the carbon market portfolio for the country, and we saw we've been very active in CDM, 189 activities, projects and POAs. And then we've had about 1.6 million CERs issued, remembering that CERs are for the CDM. And then different sectors such as forestry, cook stoves, mangroves, and energy. So lastly, we had the project developer experience, and we had we had invited different developers to give their experience. And we had from Conservancy International, who were sharing on forestry and the REDD+ work they have been doing under Vera, which has had over 2 million in issuance, and they have two of the successful Vera projects in Kenya. Then we also had Kengen, who have a very large CDM portfolio in energy, so geothermal, hydro, wind, and have issued about 1.4 million credits annually. So, and they've been doing that for quite a number of years. And then we also had from Climate Care, who have a very diverse portfolio as well, such as in water and in cook stoves, and are using the various different standards. So just the underlying the thing to remember also in terms of when you're trying to develop a carbon markets project is that you have to really think about the investment versus the income in terms of the underlying activity versus and the business case. You have to look at them both critically because you could end up not being sustainable if you get into financial issues somewhere along that cycle. So I'll hand, that's a recap for today. We will be sharing the recaps because I know there was a request for yesterday's recap as well. So we'll be sharing all recaps for day 1, day 2, day 3. And yeah, I will now hand over to my colleague, Julie. Julie, are you with us? Who will take us through the Excel exercise that we were supposed to go through yesterday. And I hope that you all checked your calendar invites. The Excel sheet should be there. So they were sent yesterday, but we will put it in the chat as well. All right. Great.
So, thanks, Bianca. Thanks, Bianca. So this is the Excel sheet that we sent with today's invite. So I'm essentially going to be walking you through what is traded in the carbon markets, and those are the emission reductions. So for this practice exercise, we are using a grid-connected solar project, and our project is in Kenya. And the whole point of the project is to generate electricity using solar energy to sell power to the grid. And as Bianca has mentioned, there are different methodologies. So after you've done your research, you'll establish that your solar project is categorized as an AMS ID. It's a renewable energy project, and that supplies electricity to a grid. And then the crediting period is, okay, the crediting period is the period with which your project can receive carbon credits. And you either have two options. You can have a 7-year renewable option where you get credits for 7 years, and then you go back and then you try to establish whether the baseline that you established for the first crediting period applies. So if then you can renew it for further 7 years, and then you can do this again twice, and or you can do it for a fixed 10-year period. And then the monitoring period is within your crediting period. You'll be, because let's say you've, as you have walked through the project cycle, you have designed your document, it's been, you have your national approval, it's been registered, it's been validated, so you're good to go. But then you now come to monitoring the performance of the project. You're going to establish how well or how poorly the project is doing based on the what you said the project can achieve. Like you'd say, your project will be transmitting 8.5 megawatts of electricity to the grid, but things could happen. So you try to check the accuracy of the performance of your project. And that is what we call the monitoring period. And for our project, our monitoring period falls between 1st July 2019 to 31st December 2020. So you'll be monitoring, this is the period, you'll capture electricity generation between 1st of July to 31st of December 2020. You'll be looking at the emissions, emission reductions achieved between this period. So the second sheet is just basically giving you the instructions of this exercise, because step 1, we are going to determine the expected annual electricity production. Oh, and just before let me go back to this, the picture, the beautiful picture we have attached to this Excel is just to give you a visual representation of what 8.5 megawatts looks like. Covers a big area of land, and you see all those solar panels capturing solar and converting it to electricity. So back to the instructions, we are going to determine the expected annual electricity production of our project. And then for step 2, this electricity generation is going to help us determine the emission reductions that our project can achieve. And then step 3 will be the business case, how your emission reductions become money in your pocket. So for step 1, we determine the quantity of electricity generation by our power grid. So this information comes from the meter readings, because at the solar plant, you have meters that they'll take readings of electricity supplied to the grid and electricity if your solar plant is taking some electricity from the grid. And then against that, we look at the electricity sales invoices, because as a project developer, you are selling electricity to someone. Let's say as Julie, as the project developer, is selling electricity to Kenya Power. So during every month, I give a receipt, I give them an invoice, and I tell them, yes, you're supposed to pay me this much for this amount of electricity that I've supplied to the grid. So electricity generation data is obtained from both the meter readings, and then we check this against the invoices submitted to the utility. So like I said, our monitoring period runs from 1st of July 2019 to 31st of December 2020. That gives us 18 months. And then we'll look at the electricity supply to the grid. What is the 8.5 megawatt plant supplying to the grid on? So between 1st of July 2019 to 31st of July, that is the month of July, the solar plant generated 1189.45 megawatt hours of electricity to the grid. But in exchange, it also it imported about 1.46 megawatt hours of electricity from the same grid. And so we need to get the net electricity generation. It's essentially, I give you 100 shillings and you give me 10 shillings. So how much have I actually given you? I've given you 90 shillings. So our net electricity generation is our 90 shillings. So for our monitoring period from 1st of July 2019 to 31st of December 2020, you'll go through the meter reading reports, you look at the electricity sales invoices. And I just like to point out that this is a very simplified version of what actually happens, because the electricity generation is read hourly. Like say for the month of July, July has 31 days in the month, and July has a total of 24 hours per day. So in reality, you will take up about 31 times 24 readings, and you will have 744 actual readings that sum up to the 1189.45 megawatt hours of electricity for the month of July. So you'll apply the same thing from July to 31st of December 2020. And for our monitoring period, our project will have generated 19,755 megawatt hours of electricity. Then how does this electricity become emission reductions? So the first step, because we are generating electricity, what we need to establish is this grid emission factor. So the grid emission factor is how many tons of CO2 are emitted as a result of generating every unit of electricity. Like for every megawatt of electricity, how much CO2 am I emitting? So luckily in Kenya's case, Carbon Africa was involved in a project that developed something we call the Kenya Standardized Baseline Grid Emission Factor. And if you'd like to read more about that, it's in the link I provided. So the grid emission factor, like I said, it's the emission intensity of the grid. And the standardized baseline, it provides the CO2 emission factor for the entire grid system, Kenya's grid system. So the standardized baseline grid emission factor, it looks at, it's an average between historical emissions, like what has been happening what has been happening. And then we also look at what we call the build margin. And these are emissions from similar projects undertaken in the previous 5 years in similar social, economic, environmental, and technological circumstances, and whose performance provides 20% of their category. It's, to be honest, it's a very complex project. It's a very complex process, but having the standardized value, which is 0.4087, it simplifies the entire process. So we have that our grid, for every megawatt hour of electricity generated, we emit CO2 at the rate of 0.4087. So we come to step 2B, which is determining the baseline emissions. So baseline emissions are essentially emissions that would have occurred in the absence of our project, our 8.5 solar project. It is saying if we used a diesel generator, if we used fossil fuels to generate 8.5 megawatts of electricity, if we use fossil fuels for our monitoring period, if we use fossil fuels to generate 19,756 megawatt hours of electricity, how much CO2 would be emitted into the atmosphere? So we have, so for our monitoring period, we have 19,756, this cell, we have 19,756 megawatt hours of electricity generated. We have the grid emission factor, we have 0.4087. So our grid is emitting CO2 at the rate of 0.4087 for every megawatt hour of electricity generation. So having the two values, we are able to establish that in the absence of our project, 8,074 tons of CO2 would have been emitted into the atmosphere, because the value is the product of the electricity generation times the grid emission factor. And this gives us the baseline emissions. This is what would have happened in the absence of our project if 19,756 was generated by fossil fuels. And then for step 2C, we look at something we call project emissions. Are there emissions in the atmosphere as a result of implementing our solar project? And under CDM and under the project standards, the renewable projects, and especially solar and wind, are regarded extremely clean energy solutions, and they produce zero tons of CO2 to the atmosphere. They're extremely clean, so they do not add CO2 to the atmosphere. Then for our emission reductions, I can take you back to this diagram. So we have the baseline scenario, like in the absence of our project, which is the red line. This is what would have happened and in the absence of our project. And then project emissions, in the likelihood that our project was emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. This is what would have been. This is the green line would have been our project emissions. And the emission reductions is the difference between the baseline and the project emissions. But like I said, our project has zero CO2 emissions being added to the atmosphere. So in reality, our emission reductions are going to be the red line up to the very last line. So it's going to be this entire section is going to be our emission reductions. So for step 2D, like I said, the emission reductions are the reductions in GHGs achieved by this project. And yes, you will do the calculations and all that, but for them to be actually certified, to be actually verified, and for you to actually be able to translate this into money, someone like David, David, you met him yesterday. David has to come and look at all the steps you took, and you have to show him how you work. You have to convince him you worked out your emission reductions as per the methodology. Your emission reductions meet the standards, and you have followed the procedure to a T. And then if he wants evidence, like I said, he will ask for the meter readings. He will ask for your energy report. You can give them in paper, and then let's say he will want photos of the same. He may ask someone questions because he has to verify that these emissions are real. This is actually what happened on the site. It's not just Julie working out calculations on paper. And then, like I said, the emission reductions, like I said, are the difference between the baseline and the project emissions. So you have your baseline as 8,074, which is this cell. And then your project emissions you have as 0. So for your project, your project achieves a total of 8,074 emission reductions. But let me just give a sample. If, say, your project did emit some CO2 to the atmosphere, if it was 10, this significantly reduces your emission reductions. But for our project is 0. So we'll have a total of 8,074 emission reductions for our monitoring period. So we come to the business case. So like I said, once David has given the green light that your emission reductions are real, they are authentic, and they meet the standards, they have met the procedure with which they are supposed to be, they have followed the procedure with which they are supposed to apply, you come to now converting your emission reductions to money. And for this exercise, I just included this as an exercise for you to take part in. Like from step 2, you have your emission reductions as 8,074. So you can bring that value here, 8,074 tons of CO2. And we have CO2 has a price, because CO2 has a price, and like any market, it's a very volatile. Yeah, the carbon market is a very volatile market. It goes up and down depending on supply. And we just picked a value, a theoretical value, and gave it about, say that the value of every ton of CO2 is about 7.5 USD. So the value of your emission reductions comes to 60,555 USD. But Tim made a presentation yesterday about that is not your take home. There are a couple of costs you have to, there are a couple of things you have to pay for as well. So you have to pay David, you have to pay an assessment fees, and these are just a few of the costs you incur by generating this carbon emission reductions. And then for transaction costs, that would come to about 4,000 shillings. And then Tim also made a presentation yesterday on share proceeds. So share proceeds are charges to cover administrative expenses, as well as assist developing countries vulnerable to climate change, the developing countries most vulnerable to climate change. So your 60/55 is not your take home. So once you'll deduct 0.2, like 0.2 to the dollar, 20 cents to the dollar, and your total share of proceeds would be 0.2 for every ton of CO2 generated. So your share proceeds would translate to about 1,615. So your take home as a project developer, as the owner of the project, Julie, my total revenue, my take home would be the total value of my CARs minus the transaction costs, minus the share of proceeds, and I'd be left with 54,940 USD. So I think that closes it up unless you have any questions.
Thanks, Julie. Maybe just as one eye on the time, we have to kind of close in 2 minutes. But there was maybe 2 questions in the chat that came through. The last one from Derek regarding who sets the price, which I think I can have a go answering. And then also there was a question about maybe very quickly, kind of, I think, to describe how the standardized baseline was calculated. So if you can take that one, Julie, but first I'll just have a go at the price. So the price, Derek, and for everybody, look at that. You saw yesterday that there's 2 market contexts, and also Clarice presented this on the first day. There's the compliance market and there's the voluntary market. The compliance market is a much more standardized interaction where you can track kind of live prices that are traded. So much more like a traditional commodity trading market. Within the voluntary market context, which a lot of the projects within the African context are feeding into the voluntary market. So as a reminder, this is corporates or other entities, individuals, people who've flown, etc., making voluntary decisions about whether or not they want to offset their emissions or purchase carbon credits. And that is very much driven by what willing seller, willing buyer. So if the buyer is willing to pay $10, $20 or $1, and the seller is willing to sell at that price, then that is where the voluntary market pricing comes in. I guess moving forward, there might be a little bit more standardization around that process as the markets consolidate. But at the moment, within the voluntary market context, it is a principle of willing seller, willing buyer. So I don't know whether that answers that question. So it's the market and individual transactions that determine the price. Julie, do you want to have a very quick go on the standardized baseline? Because there was a question on that. And then I'll just have a look in the chat if there's a couple more, and then we can close up.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So the standardized baseline, okay, it's quite complex, but I'll try to make it as simple as I can. So the standardized baseline is, like I say, the baseline is you're looking at, yes, what would happen in the absence of our project. For the standardized baseline grid emission factor, we look at existing emissions because we look at the grid as a whole. So we look at existing actual historical emissions, and then there are procedures on how to do that. You look at a vintage, you'll be given maybe 3 years, 5 years. So you look at historical emissions for the entire grid. And then also you look at something called a build margin. So a build margin, they are average emissions of similar projects undertaken in the, we look at the grid, and then we look at similar projects undertaken in the previous 5 years. And we'll look at, they have projects that have similar social, economic, environmental, technical, and whose performance, circumstances, and whose performance contribute about the top 20% of the electricity in the grid. So for the GEF, we look at something called the combined margin emission factor. So a combined margin emission factor is the average between the operating margin, which is the existing and actual historical emissions, and then we look at something called the build margin, which is the recent power plants into the grid, the recent power plant additions into the grid. So you'll have a value for the operating margin, you will have a value for the build margin, and then an average of the two give you a combined margin. And this combined margin emission factor is what we use as our standardized baseline grid emission factor. So yes, like I said, it's quite long, it's quite complicated, not quite complicated, but there is a procedure, there is a tool on how this is worked out. And yeah, like I said, it is available. And if you need further information, like I said, yeah, you can reach me on LinkedIn, and yeah, I'd be happy to walk you through how to do that.
Thanks, Julie. Bianca, there was a couple of questions still floating around, but I've just got one eye on the time, given that we do have two kind of high-level speakers in the next session. So I don't know if you want to jump in.
I think maybe you can take just 1 minute to respond to the question on the community benefits, just based on the. Yeah.
Okay. So quickly on, thanks, Helen, for the question. I mean, I think there's a variety of ways in which the community can benefit. So first of all, at the macro level, the community is receiving an increase in electricity generation. The broader community, let's say, from whichever country the project is hosted in, is receiving the direct benefits from the service provision from the project. So whether that is a cook stove, or whether that is electricity, whether that is forestry services, etc. So that is the underlying service delivery improvement that the broader community benefits from. Secondly, in terms of, I guess what you're referring to is kind of direct financial benefits from the carbon credits. I think these are set up in a variety of ways. Some projects ensure that direct funds from projects are received by the community. We saw yesterday that KenGen, I think, directs 10% to the local communities where there's a fund set up or projects are developed from that project. So I think Bianca worked on that, so she might be able to add. Other standards such as Plan Vivo ensure there's some degree of community level ownership around the carbon funds. So they're all set up in slightly different ways. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but maybe in the interest of time, I can hand back to you, Bianca.
Sorry, just give me a second. I set up this. Yeah, I think definitely, Tim, you've answered the question correctly. I think maybe just what I'll add is, we had the example of KenGen, but we also had the example from CI that had some very clear share agreements with, very many community groups, local NGOs, including governments. So I think you just need to be really transparent with the revenues, and then have some very in-depth stakeholder consultation on how the revenues are being shared. And then I think in addition, David has also put a long explanation on standardized baselines. Maybe what I'll say is that when you're doing those calculations for built margin and operating margin, they do take into consideration these other power plants that definitely use fossil fuel. So their specific fuel consumptions are factored into those calculations. It's very, it's a lot of calculations, but if you go through it step by step, it does add up, but it's a process. So I'd recommend, just as Tim did, he put the methodology in the chat, so to just go through that as well. So that helped. This was a very simplified, but thank you, Julie. I think we got a really good description. But yes, as Tim has mentioned, in the interest of time, it seems like we always get into a lot of discussion during these sessions, but we're now going to look into markets from a negotiations point of view. We've been looking a lot into how they've been operating, but now how does the whole UNFCCC negotiations come into perspective? And we'll be talking about Article 6. It's something we touched on the first day, and we now will get a lot of insight from the experts who are joining us today as well. And I'll just give a very brief introduction into Article 6 before we have our first speaker, who will be David Hines, who's a UK policy advisor from the International Carbon Markets at the UK Cabinet Office. So very quickly, I won't take long, because we do have an in-depth session on this. So Article 6, pretty much in the Paris Agreement, it's the section which is labeled Article 6. It has 9 paragraphs, but the ones that are specific to market and non-market mechanisms are 3 of those, which are 6.2, 6.4, and 6.8. It's probably something you'll hear people talking about, but you can't really quite place what 6264 is. And it's good to know the difference, because you can be talking a lot about maybe 62 and you're thinking about the other ones. So it's good to be clear on them. Now, 62 talks about parties, which is the different countries under the Paris Agreement, engaging in what are called cooperative approaches that would involve the use of internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs. And this is something that, of course, just to make it known that the whole of Article 6 negotiations hasn't been concluded. So there's no agreement on any of it on paper, but there definitely has been a lot of progress in certain aspects of it. So as I've said, we'll now have what we call ITMOs, which will probably be the new units. And there's a whole description that's going on in the negotiations about them. But what they're supposed to do is to promote sustainable development, ensure environmental integrity, transparency, including in the governance, because now this is between parties. And it shall also have robust accounting to avoid double counting. So double counting simply is like when you have an issued carbon credit, using it for two purposes. So when a country counts it towards their own NDC, but they've sold it to another country that is using it towards their NDC, that would be an instance of double counting and has to be avoided at all costs. It jeopardizes environmental integrity. So then you have the mechanism, which is under 6.4. So this is something that has been clearly stated, has been formed under paragraph 4 of Article 6, and it promotes mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions while fostering sustainable development. So it incentivizes and facilitates participation in mitigation of greenhouse gases by both public and private entities. And it's supposed to deliver overall mitigation in global emissions. So it's actually supposed to result in lowered emissions as a whole, and then to have more host party engagement. Now, this is supposed to be separate from the CDM, which we have learned quite a bit on from the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this is where the presentation we had on the first day is coming in. So CDM, Kyoto Protocol, 6.4, the Paris Agreement. And then we have non-market approaches, which is where parties have recognized that you can have approaches that do not necessarily have trading of units of any sort. And they are supposed to have sustainable development and poverty eradication, but linking it to mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology transfer, and capacity building. So there've been different approaches that have been put forward for this, and it can range from renewable energy programs, the adaptation benefit mechanism, but we'll hear a lot more about that. So I won't go into much more detail. This is just an overview, but just remember that we need to take in 3 mechanisms. So the cooperative approaches under 6.2, the new mechanism, the 6.4 mechanism, and the non-market approaches. So I'll ask our next speaker, David Hines, if he can join us, please. Great, thank you.
Hi,
Welcome,
do you hear
David.
Do you hear me okay?
Yes. So it's really, thank you for joining us today from the government, from the UK government, to give us more insight into how all this is working with COP26. And I'll just hand over straight to you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks to you actually for inviting me. Nice to be here. Thanks to everyone for coming along, learn a little bit about Article 6. So just let me know if a little bit, because I'm not sure my internet.
Sorry, I think the internet is a bit, maybe try the video. Yeah, we can try turning off the video. We'll just put up the screen, the base slide. Okay. Can you hear us, David?
Okay. Do you hear me okay?
Yes, slight echo, but I think we can try again.
Is this any better?
Much, yes. Please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So anyway, thanks for having me. My name is David. I'm working in the UK government. Specifically, I'm working on the negotiations related to Article 6, which we're here today to talk about. Amy, who will speak after me, is a true expert in all matters Article 6 and has a great presentation for you on what it is and the slightly long and difficult history of those negotiations. So I will leave that to her, and and instead I'll just speak for a few minutes at the beginning about the bigger picture, about what our hopes are for the COP more generally, and then how Article 6 fits into that. So as I'm sure you already know, COP26 will be taking place in Glasgow this November. And it has been a tricky journey for this COP, because like for so many things, the pandemic has affected quite profoundly the way in which the UNFCCC works and the way in which we can and cannot conduct negotiations. And so our COP was originally meant to be last November, but just a few months into 2020, we had to postpone it due to the restrictions imposed by COVID. But we are determined to host an in-person summit this winter, as we can't wait another year while the climate crisis deepens all around us. So we will be hosting the COP, but what are our hopes for this COP? Well, broadly speaking, we have 4. So the first, and this is perhaps the one that you may see the most, is to keep alive our ambition of limiting temperature increases to 1.5 degrees. So this ambition is itself in the Paris Agreement, and it is no secret that we are a long way off track, which is why we have been tirelessly lobbying and working with countries over the past 18 months for them to come forward with more ambitious commitments to reduce emissions, both in the near term for 2030, but also in the longer term by the middle of the century. And so both of these will take us towards net zero emissions. The second is that we need to improve people and communities' ability to adapt to the effects of climate change, including through restoring nature. This is essential because even if we succeed in our ambition of limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees, there will still be unavoidable changes to our climate and to our biosphere. And so we will need to be able to adapt to those. The third is that none of this will be possible and none of it will happen if there is no money available to make it happen. And in the Paris Agreement, there is a commitment to mobilize at least $100 billion of money for climate action from developed countries for developing countries every year starting from. This is a really important topic and commitment within the negotiations. And we've made good progress on it over the last 10 years since it was first discussed. And the latest figures show we're about 79 billion in 2018. So we still have some way to go, but we still have some years left to get more up-to-date data. But for us as the UK, we've been calling on everyone to, or at least on developed countries, to increase the money that they're providing to support climate action in developing countries, as well as institutions such as the World Bank. And lastly, we have all the various ways in which we can collectively work together to achieve these goals. And for governments, this is obviously one way of this is through the negotiations, which are what the UNFCCC is all about. But it's not just that. There's all kinds of cooperation you can have outside of the negotiations, including lots of initiatives now, which include businesses making voluntary commitments to reduce their own emissions, which will also be an important part of our response to the challenge. So those are 4 broad aims for our COP. And what should you take from all of this? Well, the COP aims are ambitious, and we are trying to do a lot because the scale of the challenge we face requires action on multiple fronts. But within this action and within these aims, the negotiations remain a core element for us. And for many, many countries, the negotiations and the negotiated outcome will continue to be the most important output of the COP. And it is for that reason that achieving a negotiated outcome, which is
recording in progress,
and which all kind of right up to, is really, really important for COP26. And Article 6 will be an important part of that. It has been a long time now since we agreed on Article 6. It's 6 years since the COP in Paris, where Article 6 was agreed. And it's 3 years since we were originally meant to have agreed on Article 6 back in 2018. That is a long time, and we have made progress in that time, but we still haven't yet managed to reach agreement. And it is now very important that we do at COP26, because time is already ticking on this decade of the 2020s, which scientists have told us will define our success or failure in limiting temperatures to 1.5 degrees. That task is hard enough as it is, and to achieve it, we will need every tool available to us, which importantly includes the kind of cooperation which Article 6 exists to promote. So it's important to agree it, and how are we going about it? Well, first thing to say is that the pandemic has stopped in-person negotiations for the last 18 months, and that has affected quite deeply the way in which the UNFCCC works and how negotiators can progress their work. But the negotiators have still been busy, and they have been meeting virtually, like all of us have been on Zoom and other platforms over the last 18 months. And most recently, we've just had an intensive 2.5-week online negotiating session where we have discussed a number of topics, different topics on Article 6, which countries identified as those where we needed to do some work to make progress. And those virtual negotiations have actually probably just about ended now. So after them, what is next? Well, in the months ahead, the negotiators will continue to meet virtually. But we recognize that solving Article 6 will be difficult. And some of the issues, which Amy will speak a little bit more about later, that have made agreement in the past so tricky, it will be very difficult for the negotiators themselves to solve. And so in the coming weeks and months, we'll also be asking ministers to consider these issues in the hope that taking up the discussion at that level will help to unblock some of the tricky problems we face within Article 6 negotiations. That being said, nothing is guaranteed, and there are always surprises, and it won't be easy. And as someone who's seen it firsthand, Amy can tell you just how difficult it is. But getting a good outcome on Article 6 as part of a wider package on the negotiations, which covers lots and lots of different types of topics, is really very important for the UK. And in the few months that remain available to us until the COP, we'll certainly be doing everything we can to ensure that we get a positive outcome. So I hope I'll leave it there. I hope that was okay. And I guess I'll pass over to Amy now, who will get into a bit more of the detail about what it actually is. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, I think I'll also summarize after Amy. That way we can have questions directed to both of you then. For Amy, her presentation, I believe, is can be projected.
Yeah, I can
assume,
project it if you like. Yeah.
Yes.
Thanks, Tim. Otherwise, I can do it if needed.
Great. Welcome. Welcome.
Good morning.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to do it, Amy? It'd be easier.
Let me try this.
Or
Do
I
I
can do
prove
it.
my age and my ability to share a screen or not? Okay, I think someone else is. I think Bianca, you're sharing the screen, so you'd have to stop before I can. Okay. Let's see. Can you see this now, everybody?
Yes, it's clear. Mm-hmm.
Brilliant. Okay, shall I start?
Yes, please. I think, oh, sorry, just before
Excellent.
you start, just before you start, I think it's good for everybody to know, I didn't introduce you before. So Amy Skeen, she's the team lead for Article 6 of the Paris Agreement negotiations support at the UNFCCC. So go ahead, Amy.
Thanks, and I'm really, really glad that the timing worked out and I'm able to join you. The virtual negotiation session that has lasted for the last 3 days and weeks of days and nights has just ended. So I'm really glad the timing worked out. I'm really glad today. I know that I feel quite sad to have missed the training session you've had for the last while, because I think it's really interesting to be involved with helping people understand what goes on when we're doing emission reductions and measuring them and crediting them, and what it means now, what it means in the past, and what it will mean for the future. And I think what I'd really like to get across today is that all of this is a journey, and you've learned about the Kyoto Protocol and the CDM. We're now going to look a little bit about the successor system of the Paris Agreement and Article 6. And, you know, every day that passes, the way in which we understand, measure and value natural assets and industrial gases as ways of fighting climate change is evolving. And David referred to that when he talked about nature-based solutions as being part of the UK presidency's delivery for the COP. So here we go. What does Article 6 mean, and why does it matter, and why do we keep talking about something that has such a silly name? You, I hope, have some understanding of the Paris Agreement, and I think in summary that the thing that's useful to understand is it operates at different levels. It has collective goals. It has goals that everybody, all countries are trying together to reach, right? And that involves resilience, adaptation, the long-term temperature goal of keeping things around 1.5 if we're ambitious, 2 if we're less ambitious, and working in that direction. And that works through everybody doing their piece in their own country through their nationally determined contributions. So collectively, they put in nationally determined contributions. Individually, at home, those countries try to meet those demands. And they should have a consultation process, a regulation process, and eventually they'll be submitting nationally determined contributions into the Secretariat. And I'm sorry if you've already covered this earlier in the session. And that's where Article 6 now fits in. So that's where these kind of cooperative mechanisms under the UNFCCC now fit into the new environment in which we operate. And Article 6 is about helping countries to deliver their NDCs more effectively through cooperation with other countries. And that doesn't just involve trading, as Bianca said. So here's the kind of a short look at the cycle in which Article 6 fits. You have the Paris Agreement is constructed to deliver mitigation ambition through a kind of virtuous cycle of improvement over time. And with the recognition that David talked about the need for finance, and then also the component of transparency. So you've looked a little bit about how you count emissions in activities, but if you imagine that all countries are accounting their emissions, they have to submit that information, they have to provide transparency into the system. And there's an incredibly complicated and heavy system called the Transparency Framework, where every 2 years, 3 years at the start, countries deliver details on what they've been doing and what emissions they've had. And that goes through a process of submission and review. And over time, the system ratchets itself up to be broader and deeper for each country in terms of what they're reporting and what they're achieving. And on the back of that is the facilitative system to help parties do that more effectively. And then every 5 years, we have the global stocktake. And I'm sorry if you've heard all of this, where everybody pauses, has a look and says, are we getting there yet? Are we achieving the goals we set out for ourselves in Paris? And what information do we need to understand what else needs to happen, and how far off our effort are we? And so that's the kind of virtuous cycle that the Paris Agreement dreamed of delivering in 2015. And that's, you know, where Article 6 fits in. How is Article 6 supposed to help this? So we have the aims, and I've talked about those, and we have the idea that over time ambition increases. And generally a takeaway should be that any of these cooperative mechanisms under the UNFCCC umbrella, whether visibly part of Article 6 or less visibly around cooperation generally, should be enabling that ambition and enabling that kind of deeper and wider action of countries, and not undermining it. And that's a point I really want everyone to try and think about for themselves, is what does it mean when we have action between different countries, and because it comes down to a question of accounting for effort and the implications of accounting well or accounting poorly, accounting for everything or not. And I think that that's something I'll come back to in a minute. If you've done accountancy exams, you'll know the concept of double entry bookkeeping. And if you think about emissions, we end up in roughly the same place. So you've probably learnt a lot about how carbon markets work. So I'm going to skip through this, and I'm going to come to the 3 instruments we have in Article 6 that Bianca has named to you. And I've color coded them here because I'm pretty tired today, so hopefully it will help you as much as it helps me. We have 3 instruments: cooperative approaches, the mechanism, the 6.4 mechanism, and the framework for non-market approaches. So I'm just going to quickly run through how they work a little bit at a high level and try and connect it back to what I suspect you've been talking about for the last day or so. So cooperative approaches, here's a picture. This approach is under the UNFCCC umbrella. The role of the governments is to provide guidance as to how this should work rather than rules. And it's where 2 countries have a system that they have connected to each other to transfer emission reductions between them for activities that they have done. Now, emissions trading programs you may be familiar with, and this is a good example when 2 countries link emission trading programs. And the purpose of the guidance is to help make sure that those systems are linked in a way that enhances and delivers into Paris, rather than does something that doesn't help towards Paris or isn't sufficient to help towards Paris. And the guidance is really designed to recognize that there are existing systems and there may be future systems, and to help countries align towards that. So even though we haven't had the rules agreed yet, as Bianca has said, we've started to see countries entering into arrangements with each other that recognize these rules as guiding their interaction for trading emissions between them. And we can come back to this. Then this is the mechanism, and this one is the one that looks a bit similar to the CDM. But the difference between what happened under Kyoto and what's happening under Paris is that under Kyoto, only some countries had targets and other countries had none. And under Paris, everybody makes their own target and has to try to meet it themselves. And so every country fundamentally could end up in a position where it wishes to sell or buy emission reductions in order to help meet its own commitments, or because it has commitments that it can meet, and it has an ability to transfer elsewhere. And so here we see a crediting system, most likely, where country A submits, there's an authorization system, very much like the CDM, into the supervision structure under the UN, and credits are issued centrally by the UN machinery and can be transferred to country B, and they will use them towards their NDC. So that's a more centralized structure, and it has it recognizes that not all countries want to or are able to build their own infrastructure to deliver an entire crediting program. And I'm sure you've talked a bit about the kind of systems required under the CDM, and you'll see that it's a very big system, and a lot of capacity and a lot of effort, rules are needed to do that. And so that's the general benefit of a centralized system, that you can access markets that would not be available in a capacity constrained regulatory system. So particularly for some of the poorest countries and the countries with lowest levels of development, this can be a really useful tool. And then the third instrument we have under the Paris Agreement in Article 6 is a framework for non-market approaches. And here we're looking at an environment where there's no trading. And frankly, this is all over the world, all of the time already. There's a lot of things that go on as cooperation between states and between companies that could be characterized as non-market approaches to mitigation. And this instrument comes from a specific, the perspective of a worldview around the need for holistic treatment of the way we engage with the planet. And so it talks a lot more about sustainable development. It talks strongly about synergies within the UNFCCC as well. And so it's a bit more of a holistic approach to looking at the way that countries interact. And this one's quite challenging because in fact it's so broad that there are many things that could be done under this instrument, and parties tend to have some disagreement as to what could be done and what should be done and how. As you can imagine, when you have 197 countries all trying to agree. So let's go back and just quickly run through again what David said about the journey, right? Because the problem we now face is that we've spent a decade getting here, and yet the world around us is moving much faster than the negotiations are moving. And every year that passes, whether it's because parties don't agree or it's because we have a global pandemic, the world itself is moving beyond the negotiation space. And you were talking earlier about the different carbon standards, and I think that's a really good example. The voluntary world, where, as Tim was explaining, corporates are using voluntary carbon credits to offset their supply chain, their activities. This world is moving very, very fast now, and much faster than the negotiations. And back in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was adopted, it was a much smaller, more stable carbon market. And now we see an incredible focus on nature-based solutions, supply chain management, agricultural crediting, all sorts of things that in 2015 were not within the mindset of the negotiators. And so that's the long road so far. And as David said, the end of the road must be Glasgow. There must be an outcome at this COP. And failing that, we will have a set of draft rules that the markets will use as a guide, but will not implement, and that will mean there is no central mechanism that can be used for the poorest countries to develop access to markets through. So what is holding everybody up? Why is it taking so long? And even particularly when I get the opportunity to talk to people who are younger than me, I feel very conscious of this endless time that is being spent, and I find it's increasingly difficult to explain it. But let me try to put it in perspective. You have 197 countries who all have to agree really detailed rules for 3 instruments that operate across the world and need to be adaptable and usable in any given country. So maybe that explains the complexity of what we're trying to do. One of the things that is a real struggle to agree is this question of finance for adaptation. To what extent, and the question is, to what extent an emissions reducing project that is aimed at mitigation also should be responding to the adaptation needs of countries, particularly those that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And while we all know that the mechanism has rules built in with it to take a portion, which you were talking about earlier as the share of proceeds, the bilateral approach, called cooperative approaches, has different words in the Paris Agreement, and there is a disagreement as to what it should be doing in that regard, and to what extent those kind of engagements should have to give a contribution into adaptation as well. And then another key question is about how CDM projects could move over into the new regime. And this is a very complicated issue. And so I think it's suffice to say that the Kyoto Protocol it does not expire, but the obligations under the Kyoto Protocol ended at the end of 2020. And there is a recognition that there is a lot of activity that is ongoing mitigation that is very valuable, that could be harnessed into the new regime, but that those mitigation activities were designed in the Kyoto context of the host country not having any obligations to reduce itself. And so there is a difficulty to agree exactly how those activities would move across. One thing that's clear is that probably they will be able to, and we're now just down to the conditions for that move. And that's one of the more detailed things that have come out of this last 3 weeks of negotiations, and I can refer you to those documents if you're interested in more. And another question is what you do around units that were of emission reductions that were generated before the Paris Agreement obligations came into effect. And this is particularly a question around CDM and the CERs, the credits that were issued. Because on the one hand, they are mitigation that has been achieved by investors who've invested, usually from developing countries, in mitigation activities at a time when that country didn't have to. But on the other hand, the more historic emissions you add into the Paris Agreement, the lower the actual new effort will need to be to meet the targets that countries have set themselves. And so there is an argument that if you use CERs post 2020 that were generated before 2020, you lower future ambition. So there's a need to balance the interests of investments made to date with the need to protect ambition under the Paris Agreement. And that's a very difficult set of choices to make because they address different interests. So we've just spent 3 weeks working virtually at funny hours with sometimes good and sometimes terrible internet connection to try to work through these and other issues. And there is, and this is the first time everyone has met since Madrid, when parties didn't manage to get to agreement. And a lot of progress has been made in the last 3 weeks, but we can still see that countries have a lot to do if they want to compromise and find agreement with each other to get these instruments operationalized next year. And so I think I would come to the point, why do we care? Well, we're all constantly and daily faced with the need to address climate change. And this is one of the tools. It's simply one of the tools that business can use, that stakeholders can use to invest towards mitigation activities that deliver towards their own country's NDCs. And many of these instruments can be used in a way that contributes to sustainable development and poverty eradication. And you can wrap around on these kind of instruments all the social benefits that you can see in some highly sustainable projects. And we've seen that happen in relation to the CDM. And if you look at the draft rules for the 6.4 mechanism, it's possible it could be a very sensitive mechanism towards issues beyond just mitigation. So, I guess it matters to everybody, because in the end, you in particular will be bearing the impacts of the inaction of the past, and we are all now working together to try to deploy as many tools as possible to get emissions under control and to enable countries to build capacity to implement programs that can help them meet domestic policy objectives through international cooperation. So if you get the chance to talk to your government, or you are government, I hope this presentation has been useful to you. And I'm really happy to answer any questions you may have. And this website has all the information on cooperative implementation. Every single document is there for you to find easily. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Amy. That was very rich, and thank you for the explanations. It's really been eye-opening. I hope for a lot of us who are joining today and have never heard of this, they can take it in. And thank you for the explanations on the cooperative approaches and the mechanism. At least now there's a visual on how it can work, because on Monday we had a talk when we're talking about carbon markets as policy instruments, and the whole issue of now you can link systems came up. So it's good to see that that's something that potentially could happen under cooperative approaches. I think, as David had mentioned, on both sides, we're hearing a lot about ambition. I think it's good to know that the presidency is definitely determined to ensure Article 6 is a part of the tools that are used to enhance with ambition. So yeah, and I'm just trying to summarize. There is one question that I'd like to direct, and that goes, I think it's directed to Amy, but it can, I'll open it to both of you. So does hoarding of carbon credits happen? And what would be the influence of China and Brazil in the carbon trade? Is there a risk that the market can collapse? And of course, I like the way you explain things from argument perspectives without touching on positions, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay, that's really helpful. I think so. Fundamentally, if you are using if you're trying to sell a carbon credit for something, you need a demand center for it, right? Whatever it is that a carbon credit is going to be used for, it needs demand. And one of the issues we've seen in the CDM is that the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol had very limited demand, and yet the CDM was very successful in generating opportunities for mitigation in developing countries. And that is where we saw the difficult price collapse around 2012, right? The EU changed their rules about which carbon credits could be used towards their systems, and the market had not got enough time to react. Yeah? And the market was churning out mitigation towards that incentive. And I think that remains the issue. David has talked in the chat about the updated NDCs, and I should have shown you a slide about the potential use of markets in the updated NDCs, and it is quite interesting. But whether or not there will be sufficient demand to meet the generated supply is really the deciding factor. And when you get to that question of what particular countries' use of pre-2020 units could be, you come into that debate. Does that impact demand for new credits? And some work has been done to understand those numbers, but they're highly dependent on assumptions made about the delivery and the pipeline of existing activities, and whether they would, whether if they've stopped operating, particular incentives would cause them to start again. So there's no real answer to that, but I think it's fair to say that you're still in a market where you're talking about supply and demand, and the more supply you have and the less demand you have, the more you create a market that has low value for each ton. Now, we do know from the CDM it's quite a sophisticated market in the sense that people are able to differentiate between different project types. And so we would expect that if that is the case, you would also start to see differentiation between project types in a market where supply is high and demand is not exceeding it. So I hope that's helpful without me straying into politics, which is not my role.
Thank you so much, because that is, like you mentioned, one of the hot topics anyways in the negotiations. So thank you for answering it in much detail. David, of course, you can share your perspective as well, but there's also a specific question to you on career opportunities for young professionals. What do you envisage for young professionals in Article 6?
Yeah, do you hear me better now? I'm sorry, earlier my camera was, okay, good. No, I can't top Amy's answer. That was very good. The only thing I would say is yeah, as Amy said, it's not really a matter of hoarding as such, as it's just an imbalance which has led to large sources of supply. In terms of career opportunities, yeah, it's a good question. I think depends over what time frame you're looking at. Certainly, as Amy already hinted, it's not at the moment very clear in the near term what the demand will be for kind of NDC or country to country generation of these kind of units in the way that it's operated under the Kyoto Protocol and the CDM. And if you look at the NDCs that have been submitted, which is our best guide to go off demand, a lot of them mention the possibility of using Article 6, but if you actually look at the countries that are actively preparing, it is relatively few. Now, that's the situation today. One of the things you can say is that in a world where you do have much more ambition, i.e. greater in line with 1.5 degrees, you would expect to see more activity in this space. And in terms of career opportunities, well, I mean, that means for many of the people that were involved in the project development market, say in the earlier years of the CDM, but then equally after you had that the crash in the early 2010s, you could see a similar thing. But I think it will also look different to the CDM market, right? Because one of the questions that we now see, which didn't come up in CDM, but I think will be an opportunity for people who are interested in this field, is this much broader question of in a world in which all of these countries have to account for what they sell, it means that somehow someone's got to work out what you can afford to sell and what you can't afford to sell, and how you want to use markets and not use markets. And it's an extremely interesting topic, because if you're interested in climate change generally, beyond markets even, we need people who will be able to do that. And all countries who want to participate in this market are going to need it. And that is both in the near term and the longer term. So that is broader than Article 6, but it's an essential part of Article 6. And so what I would say is that is going to be something that's of growing importance in the years ahead, alongside the more traditional project development roles, which will still be needed in order to generate any of these credits for trade.
I also just add as well, I think onto what David said, I think the accounting piece is a really important point, because it's really important that people coming into this field understand the umbrella we're functioning in and the implications of any type of crediting of any kind of asset now that is potentially under Paris, in the context of their country's NDC and in the context of the Paris Agreement. But what I see now going on, having been in the city of London doing carbon markets at the very beginning, a very long time ago, is that all the old people are back, but there's so many new people back working in this field. And as David said, the terrain is different. We're looking much more, there was a chat earlier, we're looking much more at things like blue carbon, land, incentivizing and crediting things that are only a partial emission reduction, biodiversity credits. It's all being brought together, and there are lots of really innovative things going on as pilots or as corporate-led investments, where many more sustainability criteria from the SDGs are being brought together into one project. So I think if you see the CDM as the original tree, what's growing up around it is a forest of different ways of understanding assets, and they are much more than industrial gases. They are much more to do with nature. And so I think if you're interested in this field, it would be important to keep your understanding broad at this stage, to look across all the MRVing of natural capital, as well as the MRVing of emissions in industrial spaces and in transport and those other sectors that are easy to measure. And I think we face this intellectual challenge of the measurement and the certainty in these nature-based solutions spaces. But that's it's a really interesting career space. I got into it as a young person back in the days when CDM was really, really innovative and strange. And I think all the time it's really important to understand the very broad global context of what you're doing when you do your work. So yeah, I would love to be at the stage in my career that you are now.
Thank you so much, Amy. I think it definitely helps when we get so much insight, especially like where you've come from. Thank you, David. I think that's really, really important. The issue of accounting as a country, if you're going to be transparent, it's something you have to be very, very serious about. And there's definitely a lot of potential. And as Amy has said, MRV and all other kinds of nature-based solutions, blue carbon, everything that's that's coming up, that's incorporating the SDGs. So I know we might be stretched on time again, so I will hand over to Tim. But just to wrap it up, I'd like to thank you so much, Amy, and thank you, David, once again. It's really been insightful. I think we can all take in the differences now with the different Article 6 mechanisms, and we're going to look for all the opportunities in these new areas that you've been talking about. Thank you very much.
Good luck, and thanks for having us. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, thanks, Bianca. Thanks, Amy and David. And we'll definitely explore some of these issues in a bit more of the Kenyan context around Article 6 piloting and some of the developments in the corporate world as well after the break. Those of you who have been with us for the couple of days, I'm just going to hand over to Diana, and we'll have a quick stretch and a break before we jump back into the content presentations after. So Diana, over to you.
Thank you, team. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, David and Amy. So this is our brain break once again. And apologies to all. We didn't give you the guidelines for today for our brain break. We will be taking photos, so a group photo. So after just a little bit after the brain break, I'll ask if we can still leave videos on for 30 seconds or so, and we'll take a picture. So just the brain break, it's a time that we get to just, shift our minds from the learning. It's really been great this morning, hearing from the recap and everyone else. So for our brain break today, we'll just do a little bit of a physical activity in whichever comfortable position that you are. You can sit, you can stand. So if you decide to stand or sit, please just sit tall and stretch your hands up. I can't see anyone, but stretch your hands up and maybe just take them to the side and on the left and on the right. Yes, just once again, just then breathe in and breathe out. Thank you so much. And then the next thing that we will do is just go to our climate change lifestyle choice. And today, it's an interesting one, and I'd like to hear what people would choose. These are just some action steps that we can take to reduce carbon pollution in the world. And so just remember that there is no right or wrong answers. You can go ahead and put the answer to your choice in the chat. So for today, would you rather buy an ethanol cook stove, or that's option A, B, disconnect from KPLC or Umeme in Uganda and have a solar power system? So would you rather A, buy an ethanol cook stove, or B, disconnect from KPLC or Umeme? I'm not sure if anyone else is from another country. So please, let's see your options coming in the chat. Thank you. I'll call upon Faith Atieno. If you could please unmute and tell us why you choose B. If you'd like to come on and say that.
I'd rather disconnect from KPLC because they're becoming a bit unreliable and they're quite expensive. For the ethanol cook stove, not really. Prefer LPG.
LPG, okay. Thank you so much. I'll call one more person. Let's see. I will call, let's see, Francis Okalo. If you could please unmute and just tell us your choice if you put something down.
Yeah, thank you, Diana. So I live in Mombasa and there is too much sunshine. I think it goes to west. So I'd rather disconnect from KPLC. That's rather too expensive and also erratic sometimes, and just go with solar. Yeah, which is green anyway.
Great, thank you so much. I think now before, I also forgot to mention that we will do a feedback survey. I'll put it on the chat, but please, if you could have a few more people just put their videos on and we'll take a picture. I'm really sorry we didn't give you forewarning. Julie, is that okay? Great, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Brian, nice seeing you in your mask. Okay, Julie, are we good?
Sorry, I was mute. Yes, we're good.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Then I will post the survey on the chat. If you could please take it, literally will take a minute or two to fill in the survey, and just, you know, we will give you a, you know, just till the end of the session to just give us your responses. But thank you so much for joining. I'll give it back to Tim, and I wish you well in your journeys.
Thanks, Diana. Okay, so I think we're into the last hour of the three sessions we've been going through, and yeah, I won't give a huge introduction to the next section. There's two presenters, Cherie Mbuya from Perspectives Climate Group, who's working as part of a project called Climate Finance Innovators, and also Julia Guko, who you know from Carbon Africa from the last 2 days, but she's also presenting on behalf of the program Climate Finance Innovators, which is a project from a group of companies, including Perspectives Climate Group, Climate Focus, Carbon Africa, German government under their ICI, so the Initiative for Climate in Germany. Actually, my understanding is it's funding, interestingly, rockets that funds that particular vehicle. And the Climate Finance Innovators have been running for about the past 2.5 years, engaged in supporting linking of climate finance and carbon markets within the African context. So supporting 3 countries, particularly Uganda, Ethiopia, and Senegal, but also more broadly working with the likes of the East African Alliance with Bianca, and on in Western Africa as well with the West African Alliance, on supporting readiness for Article 6 and looking at this interplay between the broader climate finance and the role that carbon markets and carbon market finance can play in supporting low carbon development in Africa. So I think without further ado, and Cherie, please feel free also to complement what I was saying, but I'll hand over to Cherie and for her presentation. Understanding that this section is about Article 6 readiness. So we're talking about the context that David and Amy presented earlier, and we're looking at that historical context of the CDM pipeline and the carbon projects already existing in the region. How do they interplay within the new context of Article 6, and what developments have been happening globally, which Cherie will talk about, and then what developments have been happening specifically within the Kenyan context in advance of what we hope is a positive outcome at the COP. So Cherie, I shall hand over to you. Do you want me to project your presentation, or are you okay to do it?
Yeah, I'd appreciate it if you could project it for me. Thanks.
Project, okay. And please go ahead and introduce yourself more eloquently than I did. Just give me a second. Just a sec.
I could also do it. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, it's just taking a little bit slow. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see Ike here. I was actually a member during my days in university. And as Tim has mentioned, I'm a research analyst with Perspectives Climate Group, and I will be introducing you to the status of piloting and stakeholder experiences around this based on Article 6. And this presentation, as Tim has mentioned, is based on a study conducted under the Climate Finance Innovators Project funded by the German government. And the purpose of the study was to take stock of the real-world activities piloting Article 6, focusing on early action and concrete implementation against the backdrop of the yet to be finalized Article 6 rules, without which, as Amy mentioned in the previous session, to be difficult to measure the impact of these activities. Next slide, please. So let's jump right into it. A pilot in general terms refers to testing a concept or an activity before it can be implemented at a wider scale. Currently, no formal definition exists on what an Article 6 pilot is, but we defined it as broadly as possible, giving to the definition that there are initiatives that have the potential to align themselves with Articles 6.2, 6.4, or 6.8, as Amy took us through in the last session. And we used several criteria to categorize the pilots. And the first is when participating countries or implementing entities describe or frame them as a pilot. Secondly, it's any activity that is likely to be governed by the Article 6 rules once they're finalized. And thirdly, it's in any scenario where the parties engaging in the pilots mentioned that they would be transferring or acquiring internationally transferable mitigation outcomes of the carbon credits. Next slide, please. So despite the continued uncertainty around the finalization of the Article 6 rules, piloting is continuing at a quick pace, and there's been a proliferation of piloting activities which could inform the negotiations, and a majority of these are focused on Article 6.2. As Amy explained, Article 6.4 is yet to be finalized, but once this is done, we foresee a possibility of some of the activities in the CDM portfolios transitioning to Article 6. If you look at the map, you can see that there's an early focus on Africa. And if you could see where Kenya is located, Kenya is already having a pilot under the Japan established joint crediting mechanism. And currently Kenya has registered about 2 projects under this mechanism, and it has the potential to have even more projects joining the Article 6 pipeline once the Article 6.4 rules are finalized and some of its CDM and voluntary carbon market project pipelines can be transitioned into Article 6 pilots. Next slide, please. So again, the study found that there's a large heterogeneity of activities that meet the criteria that I explained earlier on what piloting or pilots are, and consequently we developed a model of concentric rings to differentiate the concrete pilot activities and other related activities. And if you look into the diagram, the innermost circle, we have the Article 6 pilots that focus on implementing predicting activities that will eventually generate ITMOs or carbon credits and or adaptation benefits. And I could speak to one example, which is the Standardized Crediting Framework, which is an initiative of the World Bank, under which it's Carbon Initiative for Development, in short CIDEV, which supports the transitioning of CIDEV CDM project pipelines towards the new Article 6 frameworks by utilizing simpler project cycles in comparison to CDM. This project allows lower income countries to convert their emission reductions into carbon credits and access carbon markets, and pilots have been completed in Senegal and Rwanda, and there's intention for CIDEV to further expand this to other countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia. The middle circle just gives us articles that will eventually be under Article 6 rules, although they are not necessarily created for this, as was mentioned in an earlier session, the linking of the emission trading systems. And in the outer circle, we see here the enabling environment to create favorable conditions for implementing this Article 6 pilot. So this could be through capacity building, building the infrastructure for carbon markets, and research and development. So an example of this is the work that the East Africa Alliance Carbon Markets and Climate Finance is doing this morning, this session. So preparing young people to engage in this kind of activities in the future, as well as supporting East African negotiators in the UNFCCC procedures and negotiations around Article 6. Also, the Standardized Crediting Framework that I described earlier supports the countries to build their local capacities to engage in the carbon markets. Next slide, please. So as Article 6 rules are still under negotiations, the pilots are vital for testing the applications and further providing creative solutions for issues that are relatively unclear at this point. And in relation to the concrete activities we just discussed in the innermost circle, the pilots go through 3 stages, and that's what you can see in the table. So we found that most of the pilots are currently in the preparatory stage, and I could speak to the African Development Bank adaptation benefits mechanism, which is trying to create a results-based financing mechanism for developing countries in Africa to be able to finance the adaptation, to enable them to meet their adaptation targets under their NDCs. And in the pilot phase, we can see the standardized crediting framework that I spoke on earlier. And we only found that the Japan joint crediting mechanism is the only one at the full implementation stage, although the accounting frameworks and corresponding adjustments still need to be finalized in the negotiations and then will be included in the reporting. But so far under this mechanism, Japan has collaborated with about 17 countries, including Kenya, to deliver mitigation results to achieve the NDCs of both Japan and the host countries' NDCs. And additionally, we show here the level of investment that has gone into the Article 6 piloting this far. So as I mentioned, most of the pilots are still in the preparatory phase. So money might not necessarily have been fully allocated or disclosed at this stage, but we find around 1.4 USD has been invested so far, and this is likely to keep growing as the rules are finalized. Next slide, please. So I think I can just quickly speak to this, but Julie might give more context on this in Kenya. So this is the joint crediting mechanism with Japan, where it supports low carbon technologies and high efficiency technologies in partner countries, as I said, to achieve mitigation results for both Japan and the host countries. So what's interesting here is the kind of governance mechanism where they sent up a joint committee with representatives from both Japan and the host country, and then they would decide on the kind of projects and authorize the projects that would be implemented, as well as agree on the MRV methodologies and guidelines that would lead towards the emission reductions and removals, and then this would be transferred into credits that would then be allocated to both Japan and the host country based on predefined rules by the Joint Commission or Committee. Next slide, please. A second case would be the CLIC Foundation for Climate Protection and Carbon Offset in Switzerland, which is a really interesting example. And in Switzerland, they set up a sector-wide carbon crediting grouping for fossil motor fuels under their carbon law. And this CLIC Foundation supports domestic projects that generate carbon credits. And last year, the Swiss government announced that it intends to make limited use of Article 6 to achieve its NDCs up to about 25% of the NDC through bilateral agreements or bilateral cooperation under Article 6.2. And the CLIC Foundation offers an example of how these bilateral agreements can be a starting point for cooperation. And this diagram basically shows a two-step process where the Swiss government would enter a bilateral agreement with a partner country, and then they would define the quality of the mitigation outcomes. By quality here, I mean the rules and principles under which this would operate. And then at a second level, so if, for instance, the Swiss government has already entered agreements with two countries, I think Peru and Ghana, and in this case, they've already signed the agreements, but not all ITMOs that Peru would offer would automatically work under the CLIC Foundation, which is the second level of the negotiations. And so what would happen, the CLIC would have to operate within the principles outlined by the Swiss government, and then through a tendering process, get more project developers who would also engage in this development of mitigation outcomes through different activities, and this would then go towards the contribution into the Swiss NDC. And this is an important milestone because the Swiss government is a forerunner in setting up such an agreement and would set the tone for other countries once the negotiations are finalized. Next slide, please. So to conclude, some of the key insights and stakeholder experiences we note here. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, sure.
Piloting activities are progressing, but the pace has slowed down due to a failure to agree on the Article 6 rules. And the COVID pandemic has also contributed to activity-specific delays, but we did not note any terminations of these pilots. And few countries are driving the pilots with a few early movers. So as I've mentioned, Japan, Switzerland are some of the forerunners, and there's an overall increase in investments towards the pilots they're working on. Secondly, it seems that the Article 6 community is waiting for Lighthouse initiatives to build upon, as negotiation of this kind of bilateral agreements take a while and are time, so they tend to be time consuming because of high transaction costs. And the Swiss Peruvian government's agreement is a milestone, as I explained, and could lead the way for others to join in these piloting programs. Thirdly, reaching an agreement on the Article 6 rulebook at COP26 would be essential to ensure the future of carbon markets, as Amy explained in the previous session. And the Article 6 portfolio could potentially see a rapid buildup of Article 6 pipeline if the CDM transition processes are agreed upon during the negotiations, and particularly on what activities from the CDM portfolios could transition into Article 6. So whether Glasgow would deliver on this is an issue that only time will tell, but as Amy rightly put it, this has to be the area that this is finalized so that you can see a success on this front. And if you're interested in the study, it's available on the next slide. So there's a link to the website where the study is found, and you could also see what other activities and perspectives is up to with regards to the carbon markets. Thank you.
Thanks, Cherie, much appreciated. So, yeah, we've gone for a little bit of a few processes this morning, but we've looked at Article 6 at negotiations level, and clearly there's a little bit of uncertainty around that. But there's early movement already at the global level, both within countries and in bilateral agreements as well between countries. As you mentioned, the CLIC Foundation, the Swiss government, I think is one of the leading examples here, and the public announcements around agreements between Peru and Switzerland, which is quite advanced, but also within the African context. Ghana as well also has an agreement with the CLIC government as well, with the Swiss government through CLIC, sorry. So positive developments around utilization of Article 6 moving forward, not preempting any outcomes from the COP, of course. So now, Julie, just quickly, I think to just show maybe some just initial efforts that have been made within the Kenyan context, as these are still early days. So over to you, Julie.
Thanks, Tim. Let me share my screen. So hope that's visible to everyone. So like I've introduced myself before, let me just do it again for the purposes of this presentation. My name is Julia Guko. So again, I work with Carbon Africa in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'm going to make a presentation on the, there's someone talking. Yeah, I'm going to make a presentation on Kenya and Article 6. Just Cherie has given you the context, the global, what's been happening, Article 6, but we come back to Kenya and initial pilots, new market mechanisms, and what has happened in Kenya thus far. So the topics I'm going to touch on are the updated indices. I'm going to talk about the CDM pipeline, the mitigation potential moving forward, and new market mechanisms and into Article 6. So the carbon market profiles that I mentioned yesterday, in addition to giving us the context, the pipeline and the portfolio of Kenya, the carbon markets and the CDM and the voluntary carbon markets, they also present an overview of the initial engagements in new market mechanisms and Article 6. So All this was done based on publicly available data, especially on the mitigation potential moving forward. All this information is under CDM. We have the UNFCCC website. Also under CDM, there is a joint database by the UNEP and DTU, also gives information on the CDM database, and the voluntary carbon market standards. Vera and Gold Standard all have information on the voluntary carbon markets. And then the first topic of discussion I mentioned is the updated indices. So on 28th of December last year, Kenya submitted its updated NDC, stating its ambitions to abate emissions by 32% relative to the business as usual scenario. So if things stay as they are, we'll be projecting 143 metric tons of CO2 equivalent, but by the NDC, we are stating to abate 32% of these emissions. So in the NDC, we have an estimated 62 billion US dollars, and for mitigation actions up to 2030. And Kenya intends to mobilize 21% of this 62 billion, but it requires 79% from international support in the form of technology, finance, and capacity. And then the NDC, the updated NDC, Kenya outright stated its intention to use voluntary cooperation under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement and develop domestic legislation and institutional frameworks to govern high engagement in non-market mechanisms. So basically, Kenya is ready and willing to, yes, use the mechanisms under Article 6, and it is also ready to develop the relevant legislation to govern these markets. So the second topic we can, under Article 6, that we can talk about is the CDM pipeline potential. So yesterday we discussed the issuance rate. We discussed that we have issued about 1.6 million credits from the CDM portfolio. And moving forward, the existing pipeline has a mitigation potential of about 101 million. The chart shows 101 million credits could be generated from the project. And from the existing pipeline, the POAs have a potential, under the POAs, the cookstove have the highest potential with 46% abatement potential. Water purification have a 31% potential, and geothermal, electricity, and wind power have a joint 19%. This is grid power. And recent activities from this portfolio, we have new technologies. We have mini-grid technologies that we have mini-grid technologies. And then the South Korean market has looked at our portfolio and identified the COCO networks. It's the Cookstoves project. It has BioLite, also a Cookstove project, and Top Third Ventures Stove program have been identified to have links to the South Korea market. So moving forward, it will be interesting to see how all this come into play. And then on new market mechanisms, Sherry has talked about JCM. JCM is the joint crediting mechanism. It's a bilateral agreement between Kenya and Japan. And we have 2 registered projects. And in February this year, February 2021, officially 974 credits were issued and evenly acquired by Japan and Kenya. So it was a 50-50 split. So Japan got half of the credits, Kenya got half of the credits, and this was for a 991 kilowatt solar project in Kwale. So it's a solar PV project at the salt factory in Kwale. So under the new market mechanisms, Kenya is exploring alternative markets for their carbon credits. Sherry mentioned the pilot. KenGen is exploring alternative markets for carbon credits, including one of them is the transformative carbon asset facility of the World Bank. And it's a financing facility and an offset project under the World Bank, and KenGen is part of this project. And we have the COSIA. COSIA is a carbon offset and reduction project for under the international aviation. So KQ is actively involved under COSIA, and KQ is offsetting its carbon emissions by one of the projects they're actually using to offset their projects is the Wildlife Works Kasigao project. And the Kasigao project was the world's first REDD+ project to be validated and verified under VCS. So Kenya is doing well. So it's country of first. We had Mikoko as the first blue carbon project, and we had Kasigao as the world's first REDD+ project under the CCB. So this is a positive trajectory moving forward. And that about covers the new market mechanisms thus far under Article 6. So thanks, Tim. Back to you.
Thanks, Julie. So yeah, thanks to Julie and Sherry. So I think the messaging here, and I've got one eye on the time because we also want to give you an opportunity to break into groups now. The messaging is really the negotiations are ongoing. That's the first message. However, as Amy mentioned, that the world is moving more rapidly than the negotiations. As we know, the private sector certainly likes to move faster than politicians in many cases, though there are specific processes as to why that happens, of course. But yeah, the messaging is that things are ongoing under Article 6 between countries. And I just want to take 1 second to just present something quickly on something that Amy mentioned as well. Sorry, just give me 1 second. On also additionally to complement this, sorry, I was just uploading this one slide. As was mentioned earlier, so Article 6 has been negotiated. Countries are looking at developments. There's been some developments in Kenya, between Kenya and Japan. The Swiss government through the CLIC Foundation is setting up bilateral agreements, and there's one already made with Ghana in the African context. But additionally, at the same time, there is a corporate private sector process which is ongoing. So we've looked at that, the voluntary carbon market standards, voluntary carbon market projects. We heard from developers as well in the region that have already carbon assets. But if we look at the demand side of corporates now, I don't know whether you've seen or you're following the news statements around carbon neutrality or being carbon net zero by 2050 for the likes of Google and Microsoft and large corporates. And that in itself, in the short term, sees a potential massive increase in the role of voluntary carbon markets in supporting companies and corporates become climate neutral. How that plays out within the context of Article 6 and NDCs is part of the negotiations and also needs to be agreed. But it's just to show you and let you know that there is a marked increase in demand in the voluntary carbon markets from corporates since the turn of the year. So CBL is a trading platform, is just one example of a trading platform, has seen an increase in 230% of year-on-year demand. So in 2020, they sold 40 million tons, but 31 million tons in 2020, but already in the first 6 months of 2021, they've traded 40 million tons. So they're set to double or triple their volumes just this year. And there's been a lot of effort, and we can talk about this a little bit more in the final recap, to tap into that demand moving forward. So just to give you an indication that though the negotiations are ongoing and a little bit slow and bureaucratic as to be expected, countries, yes, they're moving ahead on the bilateral basis, but also on the demand side within the private sector, there is a huge increase in demand. So it's a very exciting time to be maybe launching your engagement within this context. So let me just pause there because I've overshot my time a little bit. And what we're going to do now is, sorry, I've mistakenly closed that. We're going to now give you an opportunity to talk to each other, break out into groups. Julie, are we almost ready with the groups?
Yes, just another minute.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, don't maybe launch them quite yet. Just give it a second. So you're going to break into groups now for 20 minutes to discuss 2 questions. There'll be a facilitator in each of the groups. So there's going to be 6 groups. So everyone is going to be about 8 or 9 people in each of the groups. So first of all, you'll be given 20 minutes to go through. So there's a little bit of time pressure, but we should break out easily enough. And first of all, yeah, take a very quick moment to introduce yourselves for 10 or 20 seconds, name, location, institution you represent, if applicable. And then we've got 2 questions. So let's start with the first one. Which one element of the past 3 sessions are you planning to take forwards as applicable in your professional life? So what over the last 3 days or 3 sessions have you picked up that you think is applicable to your professional, potential professional development or within the workplace you currently operate? And then the second question, if there's time, if the conversation is rich around the first question, that's completely fine. Then how do you see the role of Kenyan youth moving forwards in engagement under carbon markets and potentially under Article 6 as well? So we'll post both of those in the chat as well. And then I think Julie will move ahead and do the groups.
Okay,
But just wait 1 second, Julie, because I'll just post this
okay, no
in the
problem.
main chat, and then we can break out into the group. So a message will flash up saying that you a message will chat up now. Sorry, a message will flash up on your screen now saying to join the room. So please do join the room. And for reference, the 2 questions I've posted in the chat for everybody. Okay, so please go ahead, Julie.
So you are in groups of, you're in groups of 10, and yeah, sorry, you are in groups of 10. So every group has a facilitator. One of the co-hosts, one of the hosts will have run the session. They'll be they'll review the questions that Tim has talked about, and then you'll just have time to discuss that. Then after a while, we'll come back to the main session to close up the workshop for the day. So yeah, so we're going into the groups in a minute.
Thanks, Julie.
Hi, Bianca.
Hi, I'm thinking 6 or...
Yeah, so no, yeah, you either join 5 or 6. So yeah, so you can join 6, then I can join 5.
Okay, all right.
Okay, okay, sure. Waiting for everyone to join.
Okay.
My name is Thomas Bundi. Okay. My name is Bundi Thomas. I work at Strathmore University, where we have an energy research center. We are based here in Nairobi. And just start by answering the few questions, maybe to break the ice. In the past 3 sessions, I think everything was useful, but what I will take home will try and incorporate what I have learned in the training courses we have on renewable energy. Just try to see how we can help each other in achieving the main goal, which is reducing our carbon emissions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Hi, everyone. I'm just the facilitator here. I'm trying to put up the questions on the screen, and thank you for sharing, at least with the first one. So at least everybody could be able to share something in like a minute or two. And yeah, if possible, just you can share the camera while you're speaking so that we can see you, but it's not a must. But thank you, Thomas, once again for breaking the ice. Yes. I'd rather not pick on anyone, so I'd just kindly like if people volunteered, that'd be great.
Yeah, there's my face.
Thank you. Okay, to my right, I can see Anangwe. Are you with us? And I hope I've said that correctly. I don't know. Please correct me.
Yes.
Great.
Yes, Bianca, I am with you.
Mhm.
I'll put on my camera after speaking. My network is really shaky, but my name is Indehwa Anangwe. I work with the African Wildlife Foundation as a senior policy officer, specifically focusing on the Africa market, if I can use the word market. This training has really been eye-opening, and generally taking it down to the work that I'm doing. I will work around how to increase awareness around the carbon market and also linking it to the work we do with the communities. So for me, key is to try and emulate what you have been doing, Bianca and the team, to get this information out for people to know what is happening, and then to go back down and see how they can apply it and perhaps benefit the communities. Thank you very much.
That's great. That's great. Okay. Next is Brian. Brian, who from IE. Brian, are you with us? Sorry,
yes,
if I call up on
I'm
you.
with you.
It's how it's coming up on
It's
the
okay.
screen. So
It's okay. Let me remove my mask.
Great, thanks.
Yes, my name is Brian, the ICE National Coordinator, and I'm proud to be here with you. And yes, what I can say about the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement training, it has been good and it has been an eye-opener for the African youth. And what I've just noticed is that the attendance has been almost 90% since we began, and that is a very good thing. About the topic that I would say that I would carry on is about the renewable energy, as we can use Article 6 mechanism to curb our carbon emission. So that is it from my side, and thank you for the organization for this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Just a very small clarification. Thomas, when you were also speaking about renewable energy, did you mean in terms of projects or in terms of like the courses that the Energy Center at Strathmore does?
So we offer courses on renewable energy, and also as a research center, we have a consultancy arm where we guide people on doing projects around renewable energy.
Great, thanks. That expounds a lot. Next we have, and please tell me if I'm saying the name wrong, Jale Jazil? Jale Jazil. Oh, they've just left. Wow, okay. Oh no, they're still here. Sorry.
Yeah, hi Bianca and the team.
Am I saying the first name correctly? I don't know.
Yeah, Jale, yes. Yeah, so my name is Jale Gesile. For now, I'm consulting for Ministry of Energy on a project called Kenya Off-Grid Solar Access Project. So we are working on a renewable energy project. So yeah, it's a very enjoyable session in that as a component of our project, we are also targeting the carbon credits for the mini grids that we'll be doing. We'll be doing solar home system, clean cooking solution. So the session that I find interesting is that of calculation of carbon credits, the one which was done by Julie. Yeah, and it's a good session to to go ahead with thereafter. Thank you.
Sorry, just a clarification. Is this the presentation yesterday or today? Because she did one yesterday as well.
Today.
Now, okay.
The first one today, yes.
Great. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Next, we have Purity Mudhoni.
Good morning, all. So my name is Purity Mudhoni. I am a lecturer at Kenyatta University, and basically training, and I'm also in charge of project development within the department. And currently we're working on a project on climate change and peace in the Kerio Valley region. So for me, I think this was very timely because then it gives me a chance to integrate the issues of carbon markets, which are very hazy. But I must mention, just to make it clear, that we are working towards getting a grant from GCF. And one of the things that they are very keen on is mitigation elements. But I really didn't know how to capture that in the proposal. So they were really impressed at our proposal, but they said the mitigation component is very big. So going through the training, I was able to pick up really heavy materials that will really inform our project. And other than that, of course, it will go a long way. The whole topic on climate finance and carbon markets will go a long way in just supporting the training that we are conducting here. And also in our research, I already identified a number of gaps that we have, particularly on areas on institutional gaps, because I don't think this is very well situated, the carbon market idea and concept. It is not very well seated within our institutions, and therefore we might have a challenge in trying to adopt and implement Article 6. So for me, I think that's a research gap that we are picking it up from there. And basically, I'm appreciative of the organizers for talking through it.
That's really interesting. So just also to clarify, this GCF funding that you'll be getting, the project itself is in what sector? Is it also in energy or?
But it's well, the components are multiple, but basically looking at climate change for peace and development in Kerio Valley. So within, just to support peace, there are multiple components, including renewable energy and even conservancies, development of conservancies, and micro irrigation schemes.
Thanks for that. And then, sorry, just one more on the institutional setups, because we've actually done a study on that one in regard for government institutions. But would you be referring to academic institutions since you're from a university? Or
clearly.
Okay, great. Right. Okay, thank you so much. And next we have Jessica Gogo.
Yes, hi everyone. I'm Jessica Gogo. I'm an independent consultant, let's say, and I know a few of the hosts who have done this program, and they're the ones who introduced me to this training. So it's quite nice to kind of learn more about this. So a lot of these things I knew about, but one thing I wasn't clear about was the Paris Agreement. So it was quite interesting, and that was like my favorite topic, and hoping I can continue with that forward. I'm mainly in carbon neutrality, GS standards, CDM, things like that. That's what I mainly work in. So yeah, this is quite interesting to learn more about Paris Agreement.
Great. Yeah, I hope I mean, the Article 6 can be it's a lot. So I hope that what we managed to give at least was a good starter into it.
Yes. It was confusing for me before, because people just throw the word around, Article 6, but it's like, what are you talking about? But yeah, it's quite, the way it was broken down, especially this morning, I was just like, oh my goodness, this is a lot to take in. But yeah, I enjoyed it.
Great, great. Next, we have Janvan from AWF.
Hi, Bianca. I'm Janvan Kombo. I'm located in Nairobi and currently working with the African Wildlife Foundation as the international policy and government relations assistant. I think one topic that I really liked was, I liked actually two of them, the breakdown of the UNFCCC. And then also the other one was Clarice's presentation yesterday and her emphasis around the carbon markets and why they're attractive policy instruments. So I think that was a really, really good session that I liked. And also, I think it affirms what the discussion of this training was all about. And I think the takeaway to me, as a Kenyan here in Nairobi, I think will be about strengthening some key youth institutions and young professionals who we come and engage with on a daily basis. So the UNFCCC was a good one because as we prepare for the COP26, so we also try to learn other things, especially now that COP15, the conventional biological diversity is also happening. So we try to borrow ideas from there. And this is all for the good of the world and the climate protection that is ongoing now, and the conversations that are trending now. So thank you again for facilitating the sessions, and I really enjoyed it. And I met new people in the call. Thank you. Over.
Great. Yeah, I think maybe something I forgot to mention at the beginning is that the Alliance, oh, well, actually Suri mentioned it. The Alliance is hosted at the RCC Kampala. So it's usually, they really help a lot with these technical sessions. And when it comes to negotiation issues, it's best to get it from the source. So we're glad that we can always get you access to them. So that's really good to hear. Thank you. And then we have Elma Odhiambo. Yeah, I don't know if you can hear us. Just let us know what's the one thing over the past 3 sessions that, well, feel free to share many, but the key ones. Yeah.
Okay, you able to hear me? Okay, thanks. So my name is Elma Odhiambo. I am in Nairobi. I work with EED Advisory Limited as an analyst. So I'll go straight to the question is the element. So for me, I will call this an eye opener and an avenue to build capacity. So as a consulting firm, there are a lot of areas that would like to venture in, and sometimes you find there is some capacity that you are missing. So this training or this workshop, in as much as it was meant for the youth, I find it quite ideal, and there's quite a lot we've gained. And so for me, it's a matter of now moving from here, because the training could not be the end from the beginning. So you start it and then you continue, because if we train now and we stop, then it means we have not built capacity. And maybe tomorrow someone will be asking you, if you are practicing this, it's becoming familiar. And that's why you find most of us saying for them, they knew now to go and put this into practice, because if we don't do that, then we are going to forget everything. So I will say it's been a good training, and a lot of the materials that have been supplied. One thing I loved is when we are calculating carbon reductions or emission reductions. And so that was quite key, and plus the many other items that we learned from day one on the UNFCCC. So I will pick these, and for me, it's a matter of picking these and moving. So it's like starting your car, you're moving ahead and you want to get to a destination. So it's never going to stop here. Thank you.
Great, great. I think you bring up a really good point of how like this is just the beginning. So now we're moving forward, trying to implement. There'll definitely be harder courses for those of us who want to become auditors one day, or like just generally the content gets a lot more advanced. So I think like you always need to be open to learning more. So I think that's really great. On the ER calculation, I'm glad you said that, but yeah, because it's actually a very complicated, like what we presented today was extremely simplified, but it really did capture the essence. But all those methodologies are always available as well. So yeah. Next we have Faith Atieno, sorry. Yes, Faith.
Good morning. Yeah. Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I am Faith Odero, an analyst with the ED Advisory from Nairobi. Yes, I'm in Nairobi. So which element of the sessions am I picking forward? I particularly liked the ER calculations, calculating emissions that you're saving when you convert to renewable energy. I think it's very applicable to what I'm doing currently at work. But I also really enjoyed understanding how carbon trading and carbon markets work. So I'm looking forward to applying that sometime in the future, or probably just reading up more on it. I really enjoyed the introductory bit of everything.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I think it's good to see that also people are picking from different parts of the session. So that's really great. I think maybe I'll just say, I don't know whether Elma and Faith know, like this is also an opportunity to network, because just as Jessica had said, she knows some of the organizers from Carbon Africa. A lot of us know each other from some of these spaces. So for Elma and Faith, I used to work at EED, so I know some of the management quite well. And I think this is something, for consultants, this is something that if you start now, it's definitely going to pay off, especially because, as Tim had mentioned, the voluntary carbon markets is really, really growing. Carbon Africa, the same. They've had a lot of consultants starting there and who have moved on to other areas of their life. So like Clarice had started at Carbon Africa. At one point, I was also at Carbon Africa. So we've been in all these different places. So please take note of the people who've been giving the presentations. They're very good people to network with. Yeah, even just this group, I think it would be great if you get to know each other well and you can follow up afterwards. So I think, I don't know, I hope I haven't missed anybody. Is there anything that anybody would like to just share before I maybe go into the second question? But I'm trying to make sure, is my screen on the questions? Because I keep moving back and forth, so I just want to make sure you can see. Great.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Fantastic. So I think, yeah, then in the next, there was one answer, I think it was from Janvan, who was talking about strengthening youth institutions. So I don't know if anybody would have something to add on to that as well. It's based on the second question on how you see like youth or like young professionals engaging in this. So I know we've had the examples from the University on Renewable Energy courses and consulting. So at least we've had on the consulting part of it. We've had from AWF in terms of the institution doing more. That was from, apologies, I think you don't have your first name in full, and I didn't get it. Anangwe. Yes. Sorry, the first name is?
Anangwe, yes.
Anangwe, yes. So you mentioned AWF. Indehwa. Yeah, so sorry.
You can go with Anangwe, don't worry.
Anangwe, great. Yeah, you mentioned that you, like now as an institution, because you're also AWF, right? Or did I get that wrong as well?
Correct.
Yes, okay.
Correct, I'm with AWF together
Okay.
with Janvan, yeah.
Great, great. So you mentioned in terms of like increasing capacity, that would be part of the institution, but would it be just a general, or what would you, how do you see young people engaging? Because even now it's just like yourselves, and yeah. Is there any other way you can be involved?
Yes, so maybe I'll start from the institutional side. Currently, we have a lot of focus going to young people, and we do have a specific program for a youth leadership program, specifically looking at conservation and how we integrate it with sustainable development. And we've been, one of the things we are trying to do is to increase or build the capacity of young people in their spaces of operation in line with how they interact with conservation. And the carbon market space, looking at some of the enterprises that these people, the young people are running and managing, could be an avenue that they could exploit. But first of all, what needs to happen is they need to understand what's happening in that space and how it interacts with the work that they are doing. So for us, is to support the youth leadership program to increase awareness around the carbon market. And then as much as possible, get to link them with professionals like you, who are experts in the sector, to provide that guidance in terms of how they can scale up the operations to the point where they can participate within this market. So that's how I see myself engaging. First of all, as I engage, I build my capacity, but also to spread it out to the other young people within my sphere.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
That's very practical, at least like things. Yeah. Is there anybody else who would like to share on that particular question? I hope, Brian, I'm not putting you on the spot, but I have a question for Ayik. Hello?
Yes, Bianca, go ahead.
Yes. So, and this is another thing. I think I've also been involved in Ayik at some point in my youth. So we go a long way back. A lot of young professionals have been through Ayik. And when I used to be in Ayik, they used to do a lot of negotiations work. Yeah. So I'm just curious to know if they'd be how that's been going. How do you work? Because I know with the Ministry of Environment, you tend to get maybe a representative who will be in the delegation during COP. So I just want to understand how you go about this. Do you normally write submissions on opinions on certain topics? And is that something that would be considered for Article 6?
Okay, thank you very much, Bianca. So far, we've been having it a little bit rough, but we've been soldiering on. In terms of accreditation and also attending of the COPs, most of the occasions we've been assigning a number of youth to, engage in some negotiation topics, and they follow, for example, in transparency, and we've been linking them up with the organizations which are strongly dealing with such topics. For example, in TI, we've been having like a number of youth who have been following transparency negotiations and technology. So they've been mentored with these organizations, and also when there's a chance, they get the accreditation and also get an opportunity to attend the COPs. And in 2018, I managed to get accreditation and also support from Christian Aid to attend COP 24 in Poland. And yes, and also in 2019, I also got accreditation from some German organization to attend COP COP25 in Madrid. So we've been engaging with these organizations. So they give us on the topics that they want us to cover for them as the youth, and then they give us the accreditation and also the financial support, and then we go represent them. At the same time, we empower ourselves in negotiation processes and also mentorship. So that is how we've been working.
Great. Okay, then I see, because I know the negotiator for transparency, so I understand where that's coming from. So I think there's potential to maybe mentor a few keen, yeah, youth who would like to be because negotiations is also a lot of work. But I don't know, that's somewhere I think we can look into supporting also. Yeah. But,
sure, Bianca. Yes, I was even thinking that if we can at least get to those who are interested in the topic of Article 6 of Paris Agreement, that is, yes, maybe we can link with you so that we get a number of youth, we train them on the negotiation processes and also on how they can go about it for their knowledge purposes and everything.
No, we also need serious negotiators who can, like those who want to be like negotiators so they can follow. Not that you come in and pick out and then just someone who's willing. Because I don't think a lot of people realize when you go to the COPs, there are meetings for certain streams that run throughout. So you're not just going to galavant on everything. I mean, if you have the time to see other things, but it needs to be understood that there are meetings like for what is called 6 today. So you need to plan everything else in the other spare time. And what I've seen a lot is people pop into one meeting and then they leave. Then your information is not very scattered. So we'd have to come up with a program that is well structured, yeah, and that they can actually participate in for a while. Yeah, not just for the sake of, yes, hi, Janvan, you can have the floor.
I just want to find out, listening to the previous speaker, it looks like there are institutions that support young people to go to the COP and some of these high-level events and platforms that are taking place globally. So I'm just thinking, are there opportunities that the youth in this workshop can be given or they can be redirected to, so that some of this knowledge that they got today do not go into waste, but be taken into the COP, also just in terms of support, 1 or 2 of them. And then also, do you plan on the same, what you've just mentioned, about giving, doing some capacity building in terms of negotiating at the COP and noting down those statements and all, so such stuff. Just a question and clarification for.
Maybe I'll just touch on that quickly. I don't know if Brian has touched it. We also have 1 more minute. Okay, there's also 2 ways you can go to the COP. You can go as a delegation or you can go as an observer. So usually I think like your organization, AWF, would probably be affiliated as an observer, but I'm not even, I'd have to confirm. Now, when you're an observer, you can't go into all the meetings, but you can still follow an item and get a lot of information out of it. Like, for example, a lot of Article 6 at some point was very sensitive, so the meetings were closed. So now that only delegates can go through that. So I think the organizations Brian was talking about, like Christian Aid, etc., you can correct me, they can definitely, they sort of support, but on an observer level. So you can still access the whole of the COP session. And then what the Alliance does right now is we support government delegates, but not many. At the moment, we just support the focal points who are represented. It's like 1 representative per country. But now that I'm seeing this, it would probably be a government, maybe there could be room to develop a program where you have a youth government official, because then they can attend all the meetings and they can negotiate. You would, observers cannot negotiate though. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm making it clear, but you can still get funding to go. I don't know, Brian, if you can add on to that. Or, yeah, Anana.
Yes, Bianca, you've just summed it up. And yes.
Anangwe, did you have something to say as well?
Yes, I'll try and make it very quick because of time. Perhaps one way we can engage the youth is help them to support the negotiators, so they could help to do the research, crafting of the messages. So that way they are not only just observing, but they are picking up the technical expertise of this negotiation space and how these things are done. But I'll leave that to you to organize with the relevant people.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea, actually. Yeah, because it's always good to simplify these terms and to come up with the briefs and to help. Yeah, I agree. We can talk further.
Okay, I think everyone is back. The room's, apologies to Hope from our room, is mid-sentence. The Zoom is quite undemocratic and throws you out at times, but I hope everyone had an opportunity to have a good conversation with each other and meet some like-minded people in the groups. Bianca, as usual, our timekeeping is not fantastic. Should we go straight into the recap?
Sorry, yeah, because I think now if we report all of us, because there are quite a few groups, it might take some time.
Yeah.
But I hope everyone captured something in their own group discussion. I know ours was quite interesting, so I hope everybody got to share something. Then, yeah, we can now go into the recap, because then it can give a really good overview of all that we have been learning over the past 3 days. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So do you want to kind of tag team on this, or do you want to run through it? Either way from my side.
Well, I did the recap yesterday and today, so I think we can go through it really quickly. Yeah, you can quickly now.
Cool. Okay. So I think the key thing is just the walking through. I mean, the 3 days, sorry, it's been quite intense. 3 sessions, I guess kind of 6, 7, 8 hours overall. So thank you for being with us for that time. Just to recap very quickly, the first one was really on the foundations. And I think Amy and David really spelt this out today, actually, that unless you understand where things have come from and the context, the regulatory context, then it's quite difficult to understand how you're operating within the market. So sometimes regulation can be a little bit abstract, a little bit theoretical. But within the carbon sense, though it appears theoretical, it's actually very fundamental to how the market itself operates. So that's what we did on the first day with regard to those foundations, where it sits within the UNFCCC. And yeah, maybe I'll go on to the second slide already. So where it sits as a policy instrument, sorry, on the first day, and what the regulatory drive is to create that demand for the carbon reductions and to try to find a cost-effective way. So when money flows into your project, that is the underlying reason for that. Historically, we've looked at how the UNFCCC is fundamental with regards to particularly environmental commodity trading in regards to carbon, the commodity we're talking about, understanding that it's not just carbon, there's other commodities as well, environmental services, etc. But in particular, the UNFCCC has focused around greenhouse gas emissions, and through its Kyoto Protocol and the agreements under the Kyoto Protocol, split the world into 2, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. And the Annex 1 had a legal obligation to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And in order to meet that obligation, there was some flexibility built into the agreement, that allowed them to trade and to buy environmental commodities from countries such as Kenya. So historically, that has been the relationship of Kenya with the Kyoto Protocol, not only that, but just in relation to this, of this clean development mechanism, which was one of the flexible mechanisms governed by the UN that generated and issued carbon credits that could then be issued in Kenya and then transferred into Annex I countries. The Paris Agreement, as we've seen a bit more detail today, even though it was covered slightly on day one, is structured in a very different way. So there's no legally binding obligations, and all countries have a commitment or a nationally determined contribution. And we'll go into a little bit more detail about that when we recap session 3. And then within the context of the Paris Agreement, Kenya, and again, this was covered a little bit more today as well, Kenya has, within the context of the Paris Agreement, there's provisions under Article 6 for cooperative approaches. So how can countries work together to try to meet a collective objective? And there's some provisions that are still under negotiation, quite an ongoing bureaucratic process. We heard from the government, the UK government, and from Amy, who sits within those negotiations on the legal standpoint. So there isn't clarity yet around Article 6, but there's real willingness to get agreement around Article 6. And that Kenya, we saw at the end of day one as well, but also today, has initially set out its intention to utilize those provisions. So to recap, on day one, we looked at the carbon market as a regulatory instrument, how that was embedded within the Kyoto Protocol, and how there is provisions for it within the Paris Agreement, but there isn't quite agreement yet. And at a domestic level, Kenya is beginning to look at how it can interact with those future provisions. I don't know if you want to take day 2, Bianca, or I can do it quickly.
Yeah, I'll just do it again. I think we went through this in the morning, just remembering that project cycle, idea, concept, approval from national entity, then validation, registration, monitoring, verification, and issuance. As Amy said, actually, over the past 2 days, MRV component is really important, lots of career potential there as well. Then we have the other components that are important to these projects, the different standards. So CDM, under compliance, CDM, and then gold standard, Vera, Plan Vivo. I hope now we can say them without even thinking. And then of course, types are different. You have large, small, POAs, you have to factor in baselines. Your project needs to be additional. Need to factor in SDGs and have a lot of stakeholder consultation. There are a lot of transactional costs that have to be factored, and you have to think about that in terms of the revenues that you're getting from the CERs or the VERs. Then there's auditing that's important. So that's from DOEs or VBBs, depending on the standard you're using. So they're usually third parties, independent, that give you the audit on your emission reductions. Then, and we had an example from TÜVNOD, then we had the portfolio, remembering CDM activities that Kenya's portfolio is the largest in the region. Just to remind that there's about 189 activities, a mixture of projects and POAs, about 1.6 million CRs issued, different sectors, so cook stoves, water, geothermal, so a lot of energy generation and energy efficiency. Then we have VCM, which is the voluntary carbon markets, which, as Christina said yesterday, in the past 2 years has just shot up in terms of demand for the credits. So yeah, in Kenya, it's also done well, 26 million issued, forestry, cook stoves, mangroves. So in terms of the portfolio, I think we had we just had the, this is now the project developers. We had from CI, which was in terms of REDD+, KenGen, electricity generation, climate care. You know, a lot in the energy space was done, but there's also a lot of potential in forestry and land-based solutions, at least moving forward with Article 6. As she said, nature-based solutions are taking a whole different angle as we move into Article 6. Then, yeah, so just think about the project costs and then also what the revenues from the CRs will be, and looking at both of them, not getting stuck in the middle somewhere of the project cycle. But I think I'll just stop there. Yeah.
Okay, and then I think, yeah, very quickly on the final day today. So, I mean, many of the themes have come throughout the sessions, but in summary, I think what we see is, let's call it cautious optimism. So I think the world is moving ahead quite rapidly in its response, or at least intention to respond to the climate challenge. One element of that is the role that Article 6 can play moving forwards, and the role that carbon markets through Article 6 can play in addressing that challenge. That's quite clear that there's quite a lot of interest and excitement around what potentially could be unlocked through Article 6. However, it is mired in negotiation complications that Bianca and others are trying to work to resolve. And we're really hoping that as we move towards COP and Glasgow, that there is a positive outcome. Having said that, there is movement already. So we've seen from Shadi and Julie today that there's piloting of Article 6. Governments are looking at it. We know Kenya's looking at it, and other countries in Eastern Africa are getting ready. They're still, I think, waiting for regulatory clarity to really unlock and put those systems in place, but there is initial efforts ongoing. And I think as Amy and Bianca have both said, this corporate interest in carbon, the role that carbon markets play in supporting their efforts to become net zero by 2050. So this idea that their entire supply chains, their businesses, and we're talking about the largest multinational corporations in the world, are committing to this trajectory, are looking at the role that carbon markets can play. And a lot of that is around nature-based solutions and forests as well. So that's a clear distinction. The only word of caution that I think that came up in our group was that the huge optimism, huge opportunities, etc., but also to be a little bit cautious about understanding. We've scratched the surface across these 3 days, get a deeper understanding of what those developments are, what that regulation